Welcome, all friends, to the Regeneration Podcast. I'm your co-host, Michael Martin, with my other co-host, Mike Sauter. How's it going, Mike?
Battling a little bit of the laryngitis today. Yesterday, not a sound came out of my throat. It descended in one day. Yesterday was silence, and today I'm making a comeback.
Hey, check this out. You know what this is?
It looks like straight vodka.
It's a good idea. It's actually sap.
Yeah, yeah,
It happened
maple
to
water. They call it
Yeah,
maple water, right? Yeah. We've got a couple gallons already because the
he's
weather.
good. Yeah, I think we have 15 or 20 gallons
They
already.
bottle it, and ferment it, not ferment it. They put a little, sometimes they put fizz in it, but it sells for like $8 a six pack.
Does it really?
Yeah, Google it online.
You know what? Well, here, actually, people I know use it for instead of water for making mead, which
Okay,
I don't have any honey right now, or I would do that. But anyway,
interesting.
so, welcome to the show, and we're here, and we're very excited because we're going to speak to John Vervaeke. It's a person I met, I probably a year and a half, 2 years ago,
I
through
think
our
so.
mutual friend Nate Heil
Yeah.
and the Grail Country podcast, my good buddy. And let me so to set this up, recently a lot of you may have seen that John had a conversation with Jordan Peterson, which drew a lot of attention because John was talking about visionary experience and personal experiences, of we'll have to. I won't even venture to say what they are. We'll have let
It's a
John explain.
fascinating conversation. Yeah.
But interest in this topic for me goes to childhood, and I was trying to figure out where it happened. And my dad used to always talk to us about stuff like this, but probably it has something to do, and don't quote me on this, it probably has something to do with seeing the movie The Song of Bernadette when I was probably 8 years old. And this
Lords.
idea that people could see saints or spiritual beings or Christ or whomever, right? And my own experience, so, I'm very interested in this. I think part of what my work as a poet is, and I've talked before about this new book I have coming out next month, that a lot of what's in that book is actually a kind of active imagination of examining the landscape around my farm here in Michigan. So, and it was really, I would have to say probably more spiritually nourishing for me um, than just about anything I've done before, which took me by surprise. But anyway, and of course, my dissertation is also on religious experience of that kind, but usually expressed through poetry or other kinds of writing in the 17th century. But we asked John to come on to the show today to talk about his own experiences. And John, for those of you who might not know, which I can't believe anybody who's watching the show would be familiar with
Yeah.
John, but John came to my attention first through his series of videos on the meaning crisis. And this was, I believe, this is even before COVID, was it? Wasn't it, John?
2019.
Yeah,
2009.
so right before.
It's the 5th year anniversary of when I started releasing the series.
Wow.
And when
Made
John
a
was doing
splash.
this, I was really taken by it because, and like John, I'm a teacher, a professor, and you can see that young people are dying in a way, spiritually dying for not finding meaning in the world. And John brought this to people's attention, which I think was a great task and much needed. And and so this is kind of for John, it kind of bloomed and blossomed and exploded over the last 5 years. And I always turn to John, because I always know when I see a video that comes up with John or an article or something, that this is a man who is a true philosopher, a true
Mhm.
lover of wisdom. And there's a seeking for wisdom in all that I see John doing, that which is to me very encouraging. So John, why don't you tell us before we get into our topic at hand, um, what prompted this journey into becoming a lover of wisdom for you?
So what prompted it was I was brought up in a very religious framework. And it was, I think it's properly described as a sort of a fundamentalist Christian framework in my immediate family, my extended family. I now, looking back, would say that in many ways it was traumatizing
Mhm.
for me. There were genuine, I have clear episodic memories of traumatic experience around it. I've come to understand better sort of what my mother's motivation was for that, and uh, a lot of stuff I didn't find out until much later. And I've also, did some serious therapy around this, and I've also did a lot of philosophical reflection to try to come to a more balanced appraisal and appreciation of that framework. I, I rejected it. I had to, I think, in order to properly, I don't know what to say, psychologically survive.
Mhm.
But as I sometimes say, it left sort of a taste for the transcendent in my mouth. And I went at that time, and I'm of course, a late adolescent, and I went through a meaning crisis because your mother religion is like your mother tongue. It sort of
Right.
gets into the the guts of your psyche. Um, and then and initially I was sort of very nihilistic and all that sort of stuff. Um, and then I went into university and I took a course in the Introduction to Philosophy, and we read Plato's Republic, and I met the figure of Socrates. And Socrates provided me with a like a viable and intoxicating and attractive alternative about how one could pursue self-transcendence, but in terms of the love of wisdom, and how rationality and the love of wisdom don't have to be antagonistic. They can in fact be erotically conjoined to each other in a way that, of course, is very powerful for a young man to encounter, as
Mhm.
you can imagine. Um, and of course, there was lots of things about this that where I've come to get a more, I don't know, mature, somewhat, you know, smiling. I like the fact that Socrates won every argument, and there was all that kind of attraction, the kind of stuff that Plato
Like
talks about.
football,
Yeah, yeah,
almost
yeah.
like he beat the enemy or something.
Pardon me?
Almost like he beat the bad guy.
Yeah, almost like he beat the bad guy, and also how I could, do better at the arguments I was having with my extended family
Hmm.
about aspects of Christianity.
Hmm.
And there was an instrument. There was two things. There was an instrumental attitude, but there was also, I think, a genuine existential calling that I experienced.
Mhm.
And the second grew, and I took up academic philosophy. But the problem was, at that time, academic philosophy is not about the love or cultivation of wisdom. It's this other thing: conceptual analysis, techniques of argumentation, meta reflection on ethics and science. I found all of that extremely valuable. I appreciated greatly the skills I was being taught, but the hunger that had been at least ignited in me by confronting the figure of Socrates and the practice of Enlenkus and so forth, and the mix of what I would now call the imaginal and the rational, and um, that was still there for me. But I did, as many people are wont to do, because of my ignorance of my own tradition. I thought that I had to turn to an Asiatic philosophy to get that, and so and for me, it's never been about gathering beliefs. I took up a serious Tai Chi Chuan. There was a place down the road, literally down the road, where they taught Tai Chi Chuan, Vipassana meditation, and meta contemplation. That's where I initially got now the idea about an ecology of practices, because they didn't call it that, but that's what they were doing.
Mhm.
And this opened me up profoundly. And then what happened is I moved from philosophy to cognitive science, and the people in cognitive science were starting eventually to talk about this stuff about mindfulness and transformation and meaning. Um, and and then about at this time, I encountered the work of Pierre Hadot and the idea, the argument of philosophy as a way of life. And then
Mhm.
I got into the Stoic and Neoplatonic traditions and discovered, yep, yeah,
There it is.
Right
there it
there.
is. Right. And so in a way that was very fortuitous to me, and I'm grateful for it. I'm not claiming any authorship over it. All of these things came together,
Hmm.
and they started to mutually reinforce and take on a life of its own. And then I was invited to teach a course on Buddhism and cognitive science, and I started doing this, talking about this, and I realized that the issue I was talking about was not personal or idiosyncratic to me. When I started talking about wisdom and meaning in life and self-transcendence, my students' eyes were like,
Hmm.
feed me, like you said. And then that, and then I started doing a course on the psychology of wisdom, and same thing. I've just taught a version of it today. And um, and then a student came to me and said, you should turn all of this and turn it into a YouTube series. And that's how Awakening from the Meaning Crisis got started. And I've then been very lucky that my personal proclivity of seeking to aspirationally follow
Hmm.
Socrates. I have a whole series called After Socrates where I try to
Mhm.
articulate that for people. And my personal quest and my professional life have just mutually dovetailed, and both my academic career and my public career have dovetailed around this. And I am like I said, I want to be, and I feel that I am humble about that. I'm just grateful that all of that has fallen into place. But I very much feel like I am now being carried along by something that I'm participating in.
Hmm. Well, I think that's that's really wonderful. Like, as also being a teacher, in teaching very much in the same kind of framework, when that I could, which is why I switched when I was teaching intro to philosophy. I did the school's curriculum the first time. The second time I said nope, and I pulled out the Ado
Mm,
and Marcus Aurelius, and
mhm.
I think we did the symposium and got the Tao Te Ching and a couple other things. But you could see the students felt fed finally for the first
Yes.
time,
Yeah.
nourished. And and I think part of this for me is and I've written about this a lot in my books, but and you talk about it in the way you talk about practices,
Hmm.
right? And Hadot talks about practices. Philosophy is not, like he says, it's a way of life. It's not a collection of data and learning a certain set of arguments, or you know what I mean, which is how it's usually taught. But that's not what students want, and that's not what human beings need. Because I think we all crave wisdom of some kind. And for me, this led to sophiology, because it's kind of a because some of the sophiological heroes, I guess, with Vladimir Soloviev and Jane Led and John Portage, their initiation into a sophiological way of being, actually, and Jakob Burma starts with a vision. But as I as I encountered that, and actually also the Catholic philosopher or theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar,
Yeah.
where they talk about the disclosure of beauty,
Hmm. Hmm.
and where you could, and also how a contemplative disposition toward nature or literature or any music can disclose something that's greater than the sum of its parts,
Hmm.
right? And which to me that seemed, I had some, I would call them visionary experiences as a young man, but some of them can be crazy if you you know what I mean, if you're not prepared for it, if you don't know what it is, it can be disconcerting, and people actually run into trouble, as Jordan told you in that interview. It could be dangerous, right?
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
can be
Hmm.
dangerous. um but to me it seemed that what at least that contemplative disposition toward things could was a safer way to avoid the danger, maybe a little bit, or maybe to minimize some of the dangers that would happen. For instance, and then we'll get into the heart of our mystery here. So when I was 24, 25, I was like you, I kind of drifted away from my religious upbringing as soon as I turned 18. My mother said, you have to go to mass until you're 18. I turned 18, stopped. And but I had been hanging around with some Hare Krishnas. There was a big Hare Krishna temple in Detroit where I'm from. And one weekend, my girlfriend and I we went away to a cottage and we spent the weekend there. And I was meditating on Lake Huron. And I had this kind of, it wasn't really a physical vision, but it certainly felt like a presence. And I was beholding something. And I saw the Kalki avatar or Krishna on the back of this white horse coming across Lake Huron. And, you know, I didn't freak out and I just kind of had this experience. Well, that was something serious just happened, you know, and it just so happened that that day was Sunday and we went on our way home and we stopped at the Hare Krishna temple because they used to always have a feast on Sunday afternoons and prayers and stuff. And that just happened to be a big feast day of Krishna. I can't remember which one it was. And I told one of my friends there what had happened. He said, "Oh yeah, I can see that." Um, Now I hadn't thought too much about that for a long time until just last summer when I was out scything in the meadow across from our house, and and it was thunder in the distance, and I started thinking about that experience. It was some 35 years ago. Um, and I didn't have at that time anybody to talk to about that, to give me, to give me reflection, and other than people who didn't have, kind of a philosophical or intellectual grounding or spiritual grounding to offer me any advice. So I didn't really bury it, but I didn't think about it a whole lot. But it was always present. But when I saw your video with Jordan the other week, that's the first thing I thought of was my experience.
Hmm.
And I wonder if you could share with us what that experience was and maybe talk about what you think that means.
Sure. I want to first comment on what you just said because I think it's important. I think one proper dimension of the meaning crisis is not only this wisdom famine that we've been talking about, it's also that it's probably, I mean, I've heard different estimates, somewhere between 30 and 40% of the population have anomalous experiences. And many people do not have, and that seems to be relatively independent of their religious background. There
Mm.
are atheists reporting these and writing
Hmm.
books about them. But the thing is, we have no framework with which to provide people how to properly metabolize these experiences, and then what often end up happening is people try to sort of do it in an autodidactic, fragmented way, which can often be very self-deceptive and harmful. And so I just want to comment, I think the fact not only is there a wisdom famine dimension to the meaning crisis, there's a lack of a framework to help people process these experiences that seem to have a very high spontaneous rate within the population. And then of course, we can add in, people who are doing practices to induce them. And of course, then the psychedelic renaissance is also pushing them. And
Yeah.
so I'm making an argument that I think there's even a moral obligation to start asking ourselves, and I want to do it philosophically and scientifically. I'm a cognitive scientist. What is a proper framework that we could bring to bear upon these experiences such that people could metabolize them and realize them as the cultivation of virtue and wisdom and not spin them off into narcissism or go
Hmm.
down rabbit holes of their own personal magical metaphysics or whatever, right? There's all kinds of ways in which people spin off from these things.
Right.
And so I just wanted to make that point. It's kind of, I think, so part of what motivates me is not only the hunger, it's also the danger, if I can put it that way. So I just wanted to comment on that. So thank you for giving me the
Absolutely.
space to do that.
One quick
Um,
question about that though, John,
yeah,
just if you
please.
don't mind,
I
if
don't
you
mind.
were, that's a very, I think, noble project to build that up again. Do you feel like you can, to take on that project, or if people do, is there a pretty good body of work already from the likes of Timothy Leary, Aldous Huxley, Gerald Hurd, Alan Watts, or do we have good insights from them? When you talked about the Renaissance, you implied that earlier generation, that documented psychedelics and things like that. Just
So
to, yep.
no, we have new people now, and new theory
Mhm.
and new data and new measurement techniques. and new things like the bigger picture. My friend Ellie Biner, you know, the thing with DMT is it's ephemeral. It just lasts briefly.
Yeah.
Well, you know what we can do now? We can hook people up to IV and they can have extended experience. And then we can have multiple people. And because they have extended experience, their phenomenological detail is greater. Like you get things that are really interesting. Like Ali and I were talking about this, that when it goes longer, people initially they're sort of super fascinated with the content of the experience, the entities. But when it gets extended, many of them flip to they're more interested in how, like they're more interested in the process rather than the content. And then they start to also start to take responsibility. Like, how am I respond? Like, and you get a, and that's just because we now understand better the chemical. We have the technology. We can properly put people in a safe space. We understand we have to get multiple people and get them talking to each other. Like, we have better research techniques. And Michael, that's just one example of many, many things,
Yeah.
right? And so you know, it's not just psychedelic experiences. The Griffith Lab is doing all kinds of stuff on mystical experiences per se. There's a lot of work. There's a burgeoning of work, both empirical and theoretical, that is happening right now. And I'm grateful that I get to be a part of it and participate in it and talk to a lot of these people. So you get people who are bringing in sort of cutting edge cognitive science to bear on these phenomena who, you know, have we did get, and I don't want to be dismissive, we often got good phenomenological descriptions from the past, but now we can start to link the phenomenology to the functionality. Like, for example, my lab, we did an experiment. You would have thought this would have been done. It's actually it's a correlation, but it was an empirical study, I should say. Is there a correlation between having mystical experiences and enhanced meaning in life? There's a question to just ask, right? And the answer is, unsurprisingly, yes. But when you try and look at, yeah, but what is actually mediating that? It's not so much the content. It's something that looks like more like the insight machinery, something like what's going on when people have that aha insight experience.
Right.
And that tells you something really interesting about, you know, mystical experiences and their potential relationship to flow experiences, etc. I don't want to. I mean, I have, and I do talk about that at great length. But I'm just trying to give you a taste of how I could answer that question.
And brilliant. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would add, I mean, that's also my experience as a musician and poet is the experience of the beautiful, right?
Yes.
Which I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with the wonderful, you'd kind of call him a new age guitarist, Michael Hedges, who died in 1997. We were really one of the most innovative guitarists ever. And I saw an interview with him one time, and he talked about, well, every time I write a song, I change the tuning of the guitar. And the interviewer said, well, why do you do that? He goes, because when I do, an entire universe opens up.
Yeah.
Which is the experience of music. Even, you know, you could hear a piece of music you've heard 100 times, but it's that one time
It's the falling in love
when
experience
it
too.
opens up, right? Because you open up as the audience for that. So so tell us what happened with you in the story related to Jordan.
Yeah.
And it was really fascinating discussion, but I think there are some resonances with what I went through when I was 25.
Yeah.
To a degree.
So, I mean, it was interesting. I talked about it at length in one of the episodes of After Socrates when I called this Socratic shift, and I was making the argument for understanding the self as dialogical rather than monadic. And I did this at length, and literally, you know, tens of thousands of people watched it, and not much blowback. As I'll use your word, Michael. But this one was different. I guess it's because Jordan Peterson, and so the experience was, I was, I'd already been doing sort of imaginal practices, very much influenced by Corbin and other people doing work on the imaginal. And I've been doing a lot of, I'm going to be giving a talk on Saturday at a cognitive science conference about the imaginal and how it's central to being rational.
Mhm.
It's really crucial
Yeah.
to being rational.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, um, I think of sort of four dimensions of the dialogical. We talk about DIME, the dialogical, the imaginal, the mindful, and the embodied as sort of four dimensions you want to be making sure you're touching on if you're trying to cultivate wisdom. And so I've been doing imaginal practices. And then in addition to that, um, and this is what I want to say. I was lucky that there was an entire ecology of practices that I have been practicing for literally decades wrapped around
Right.
this, right? And so I want to be really clear about that. And so and then I was starting to do, and it was not just scientific exploration, but it was also personal. I was doing some IFS, the self-therapy work, and the book was especially written. This is one of the pronouncements about IFS is it's very powerful for sort of self-therapy, especially if you sort of toggle between doing it by yourself, with yourself, and doing it with another person. And I was doing it with a very close friend of mine. Many of you might have seen him. He's the associate director of the Vervaeke Foundation now, Christopher Master
Mhm.
Pietro, right? And we've done a lot of work together. We continue. He's next to my beloved partner. He is the most important person, that
Right.
that I have sort of a friendship with. I have a profound relationship with my kids, but they're my kids, and that's a different thing,
Mhm.
It
right?
is.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So we were doing IFS and doing it quite significantly. And, you know, and there was both the therapeutic, tuning in. And I also got to talk to my good friend, uh, Mark Lewis about this, because not only is he a great neuroscientist, he's also, a former addict, and he also is a strong believer in, I think that's the right way to put it, IFS. And so doing this and, seeing I have some criticism of Schwartz's ontology and his psychology, and I'm doing that science thing, and I'm also doing the therapeutic thing, and I'm there's a healing process going on, and trying to deal with some deep issues around. Um, because of my upbringing, I have an anxious attachment style, and it was impacting my romantic relationship. So I was doing work on that. So I'm trying to convey that I'm coming at this with, and I also have Chris, who is like almost my second self. And so I've got this tremendous mindfulness around it. There's this scientific investigation. There's this therapeutic going deep into attachment, which goes again into the guts of the psyche. I have my good friend, Chris, and we're going back and forth. And so we're doing this, and I want to convey we're doing this very deeply. Um, but also,
Wild.
pardon me?
I said wild. It's great.
Yes. And you get the parts work, and they get this semi-autonomous thing where they're talking
Mhm.
to you, and you have to do this thing, and we can maybe talk about it. You have to lend them your voice until they take over the voice from you, right? And that's when that flip happens, that's when you start to get some of the therapeutic benefits, and you feel parts of your psyche being healed just because they're being allowed to speak. It's
Mm-hmm.
this powerful and of course, and this is part of the work that Rowan and others have done, right? And this is something Schwartz doesn't talk quite enough about. The parts revolution is happening in psychotherapy. Like there's all
Parts.
of
Yep.
this.
Yep.
Yeah, all of, Jungian, neo-Jungian, Gestalt, neo-Gestalt, dialectical behavioral therapy. Like all of this is happening, and they're all converging on this sort of set of practices. And I don't think that's happenstance. I think
Mhm.
we're moved to the place where we're getting out of Charles Taylor's buffered self, and we're
Mm-hmm.
starting to open up, right, in a profound way. And so all of this is running, and then and I'd had just a particularly powerful session with Chris. We took turns being the person doing the IFS and the person facilitating it. And I had been doing it, and he had been facilitating, and I came home, and then I was doing it, and I was actually writing it out and all that stuff, and I was doing a practice. And so I'm in the middle of doing a parts work, and I'm talking with a part, and then presence comes in psychologically, but more than numinous, archetypal, and sort of says, okay, put all that aside. You're going to interact with me right now. And it's like, okay. And like you, I had enough mindfulness training and rationality training and stuff to not just sort of, I was able to sort of orient quickly. And I was also doing the IFS, and you got like that prepared me. Um, and so I said, well, who are you? And I'm Hermes. And right. And of course, part of that just, I mean, I'm I'm this sort of meaning maven, right? I'm about meaning, I'm about communication, I'm about bridging between the worlds, right? Right. So this just goes deep into me, and I realize, oh, this is something, it's calling to something deep, but it's also calling beyond me. It's easily trans egoic, and I get a sense of it even being transjective. It's something that's not just within my subjectivity, but also picking up on ways in which reality can be disclosed to me, because of course that's what hermeneutics does, right? As it gets into the beauty of the text and reveals something that you haven't seen, discloses it. And like Heidegger, I think there's a hermeneutics to experience and not just a hermeneutics to text and
Mhm.
all of that, right? And so again, I have that, luckily, I have that there, so I don't just get pushed over by this numinous presence. And I think, oh wow, and I dialogue a bit, and now I'm not my like that mental imagery is on a continuum, and some people are a fantastic. They can't. I'm not there, but I don't have like I'm not Jung. I don't have vivid, almost hallucinogenic mental imagery, and so I was, and IFS I found so powerful because you could do it dialogically. You could write in a dialogue. And of course, that's very Platonic. And I fell into that very readily. And so I had a good friend, Anderson Todd, who also you might have seen him. And he's a psychotherapist. He's a Jungian, but he put me onto Raff's work, ally work. And I went through the book, I did the practices, and I went, whoa. And I didn't realize there's this whole community that's doing this. And I started regularly and reliably setting aside a time where I would have written dialogues with Hermes, and continually surprised by the wisdom that comes out of it. Two ways in which there's wisdom. One is I often get advice that I couldn't have sort of generated on my own. I'll try and give one piece, because I'm trying to make this as concrete as possible so it
You're
doesn't
doing
just
great.
and so and here I got a sort of a little bit of my psychological dirty laundry, but I'm wrestling with you know fame, or approaching the limelight of fame. And part of me is I'm really concerned about it, and trying to be virtuous, and that's part of the reason I set up the Vervaeke Foundation, to keep a lot of things at arm's length and moderate for me. But there's also a part of me that wants the fame, like it's like we're primates, and right. And I'm trying to counterbalance that.
Mhm.
The problem, and my partner Sarah was really helpful about that, because initially when people were coming up to me and they're like, and they were sort of having a moment, I would push them away because I didn't want to become the guru. And she
Right.
said, don't do that. You're all about connecting and religio. They're having a moment of connection and you're shutting it down. And I
Mhm.
said, well, I don't want to become the guru. She said, well, treat it like they've come up and and you and them start playing beautiful music, and then the music ends and they go away, and you enjoy it while it's there and you let them have their moment. And so all of that was happening, right? I want to, but there's still this, and it was this thing about, wow, I could tell there was this knot in me about, well, I'm almost famous, and there was kind of a resentment, um, about that. And then Hermes said to me, he said, stop wrestling with this that way. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, look, being almost famous is a gift. Because if you're almost famous, you can talk to the famous people, but you don't have all the temptations and the problems of the famous people. This is where you want to be, where you can most readily do the work you want to do and be the person you want to be. And I sort of like, I mean, and I'm trying to be honest, I was like, wow, that's really good. That like it was like almost like you would be in therapy, and like you'd get
Mhm.
that kind of reframing. So that's one of many examples. That's in the content of the interactions, but the relationship itself, because part of wrestling with all of this, and this has been a long-standing issue with me, is I'm a good teacher, I think. I seem to get lots of evidence for that. I think I'm a quite good theoretician. I get lots of about that. And so, sorry, gentlemen, I'm going to have to try and say this, and you're going to have to be charitable because I'm not trying to be too,
This is great, John.
okay. I come up with good ideas to put it in sort of, and I can do it quite readily, and people, right? And I've always had, an ambivalence towards that because a lot of these don't come from me in an ego-driven fashion. And so I often felt guilty taking credit for them, but I
Mhm.
also felt weird, like, well, who do I give credit to? And as
They
you see
don't
from my,
come in an ego-driven fashion.
Well,
That's
because it
key.
comes
They don't come in an ego-driven fashion. Right.
because they come
right.
naturally. Because they come naturally.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes. And as you can see from my public work, I really love and want to give credit, right? It's very important to me.
Mhm.
And so I was always sort of torn about this. And now it's like, oh, there's John doing the, and then there's Hermes. And I can give credit to Hermes for all of this and talk to him. And it's just alleviated that knot in
Mhm.
me so
How did you
both.
name it? How did you name it before, though? At all, this thing was there. Did you have any name for it prior to Hermes?
I would just say
Like your
the,
muse or anything? Yeah.
well, no, and I should have because
Yeah.
Hermes is my muse. Hermes is both the muse and the musicality of my inner intelligibility, right? But I
Your
would say
daemon, your angel, anything.
yes.
Okay.
And I would just use very sort of tepid terms like intuition or the unconscious, which wasn't particularly helpful to me. It would be a theoretical label, but it didn't give me the kind of moral satisfaction I needed in order to make that knot unknot.
Mhm.
Um, and so, in two ways, both and each one of these is just an example of a much richer ongoing things. They're this is how the relationship's unfolding. Now, it's almost always internal, but it's sort of internal, external insofar as I'm writing, right? And it's that again that you give voice, and then the voice takes on a life of its own.
Mhm.
Um, but there was one time um, where I actually had what I would call a visionary experience. I was getting into bed, and that presence seemed outside of me, and it seemed like an angel completely in bronze, and it was just sort of startling to me. And then when I sort of dialogued about it, it was like, yeah, don't make a big deal of it. That was just helpful, right?
Mhm.
And okay,
Well, no,
so
it's interesting.
that's about it.
It's interesting with when you mentioned
Wild.
Hermes, I mean the guide of souls. I mean, because that's kind of what you do
Yeah,
for a living, right?
yes,
The psychopomp. And you know, also, I think it was in the interview with Jordan, but you use a word that I use quite often in my work, which is mitaxu, right?
yes.
The between.
Yes, that's what I
Yeah.
meant about transjective. That's my modern word for the metaxu. It's neither subjective or nor objective. It is that which binds them and guides between them and moves between them, like aletheia in Heidegger's sense,
Right.
right? And so, um, yeah, and it's an ongoing thing. And now I'm doing a lot of cognitive scientific research around this. Geiger's book on the third man factor, and Alderson Day's new book on presence. All the work on people who hear voices and are not schizotypical or psychotic. And all the work on people having muses, people like Robert Louis Stevenson, who were writing novels and the characters would come alive and he would wake up and they'd be talking to each other.
Mhm.
All the stuff that's happening in lucid dreaming once you open this door, what I've realized is there is a huge family of phenomena. And
Right.
to my mind, that means there is a legitimate scientific question to be investigated here. And that is so not only
That's
am I doing a personal practice, I am undertaking that scientific investigation.
right. And I think,
John, I gotta ask you, have you ever, oh, go, yeah.
go ahead, Mike.
I was just at one book, you're listing a bunch of books. Have you ever, when I was reading your stuff, I thought immediately with your quest for meaning of Owen Barfield, and
Of
then
course,
he has
yes.
a book called, Unancestral Voice and so forth, where he calls it the Megiddo where this other entity that's part him and also transsubjective, he finds it in the historic personality of an old Hasid, Joseph Caro, but he calls it the Magid. But it's the unancestral voice, and it's all written from this perspective. And I wondered
What's
if you would.
I've
It's called
read
Unancestral
Barfield.
Voice. Yep.
What's the book's called On Ancestral Voice? Is it a book or an essay?
Yeah, it's no, it's a book, and he uses the same trope or experience in a sister book to that called speakers. No, not speakers meeting. I forget, but Unancestral Voice. It's all about
Owen Barfield,
transsubjective.
right?
Mhm.
One of
Yep, yep.
the Inkling.
That
Okay,
could
well
be.
That same guy.
and of course I know about Barfield because he's got this
Yeah,
notion of participatory knowing that I do a lot of
and
work on.
meaning. Yeah,
Yeah, very
absolutely. It's
much.
crucial. Yep. And Michael, I'm sorry. Thanks for that little.
So, so where I was going is, I mean, for one thing, I mean, of course, Hermes being the god of writing, and you're doing this dialogic work, which is
Yeah,
writing, right?
yeah, it's a personification of something, right? And
Mhm.
that's right.
Mhm.
Yep, very
Yeah,
much.
and I had when I was in graduate school, I had a real identification with Hermes. Plus, he's the trickster. He's funny and
Yeah,
right. But the other thing, and I couldn't help but think of this when you were talking about this, and then you mentioned Robert Louis Stevenson, and really, I wonder if any work has been done with poets or composers from a scientific perspective exploring this exact thing. Like Czesław Miłosz, the Polish Nobel laureate, when they asked him how he wrote, he said, "I have a daemonium, which just
yeah,
takes over." And I know this from experience. And in fact, even when I play music with my friends, for instance, we get into kind of to an improvisational mode where you don't know where anything's going, and it happens, and you don't even, you lose track of time. And when it finishes, we say we call it mysticism, right? I don't know what happened, but that was so beautiful. We could never do it again. Um, but this is so important, I think, what you're talking about, because the classic
Mhm.
work Mysticism by Evelyn Underhill, where she talks about different individuals having and tries to look at the phenomenology of mysticism, but she can't help but bump up against poets
yes, of course.
because there's something extraordinarily resonant with that, because they are also not everybody, but or any novelist, but certainly Plato talks about it
Yeah,
with Diotima, right?
yeah,
And there's something that happens which in that act of composition where you like you said, it's there's part of it that's very rational and part it's logical, but there's another part that's erotic or other in some extraordinary way. Otherwise, it won't happen. If
yes.
it's too intellectual, it won't happen. If it's too out there, it'll be like a mushroom trip, and you don't get anything from it. We'll just come
Yeah.
back exhausted. So that's, to me, that's supremely interesting that what you're doing is bumping up on what I'm doing, but in a creative manner, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and I'm trying to do work. I'm trying to track down any scholarly work, scientific work, philosophical work on the artistic muse. I'm a big Beatles fan, and I was always perplexed by Paul McCartney.
I
Uh,
know.
right? Eleanor Rigby, like astonishing music, astonishing poetry. Yesterday, same thing. And then Paul talks, and you go, "What? This is the guy that."
Yeah.
Right. And that's no insult to him. I mean, he like um but like
I
that.
think Leonard Cohen's Suzanne is the mystical genius work of the 20th century, where it was a real girl. It's almost like Dante, but the divine feminine in Suzanne, in these three movements in that piece, are of mind-blowing proportion. That would be my biggest example of it was in the very personal part of him, with a love for a lady you can see on YouTube. She still exists, and she's like,
Wow.
"Why didn't he ever send me any royalties?" Right? But but through her, he had the whole divine feminine, and all the imagery is there in that one song, Suzanne. You know,
The interesting thing for me is how this moves from just imagery to like presence. There's a
Mm.
personification of the presence of a perspective. Like, and I mean, people go, "Oh, that's so weird." You do it every night in your dreams, right? You
Yep.
have these you have these other minds, and we now have some research from lucid dreaming that they seem to have perspectives other than the ego perspective, and they seem to be able to tell you things that you don't know. And again, most of the
Right.
population is doing this. There's a lot of untapped potential, and now I want to say something. I respect people who are like who are that they're writing to me in kindness, and they're worried, and be careful, and I get that. Like, as we were talking around earlier, if you
Sure.
don't have a huge framework around this can blow you to bits, right? And if you don't proceed cautiously and respectfully, even reverentially, it can blow you to bits. But on the other hand, I don't want. Uh, I think there's a potential here that is very, very powerful and needed right now in an important way. Uh, again, I don't know. I don't want to be I'm not trying to be self-aggrandizing. I'm
Right.
not, right? But
Wait, what your work makes me think is the old trope that why are we blasting off going to the moon? When Dostoevsky, through others, like the work you're doing, is taking that much more important journey in the inward direction. And it's kind of a poetic view of what you're doing.
thank you. Being compared to Dostoevsky is a little bit
Yep.
humbling, but again, it's like if my intuition, and I think I have the right to trust my intuition a little bit. I've been a cognitive scientist, for since for basically 30 more years, right? I started a long time ago, and I have a strong intuition, and it seems to being reinforced by the investigation that there's a huge phenomena here that needs proper, careful, rigorous, reflective study. And not just from the outside, but anthropologically from people who are also on the inside doing it. Um, and that is my response. It's like, yes, to people who have the blowback. I'm talking about the blowback is,
Mhm.
yes, I understand. And when it's loving, I thank them and I respect, and I try to reassure them. I'm not going into this, I hope, irrationally or stupidly, right? But on the other hand, I want to say, but there's an opportunity here. And every time we have opened up to this properly and rigorously about dimensions, about dimensions of the psyche, dimensions of cognition, something has been gained
Mhm.
and um, so I I feel I feel there's both an epistemic and a moral call to do this pursuit.
Right.
Let me ask, I think it would be my biggest question would be in the poetry, and Michael, I'm going to need your help, but in the poetry of the divine feminine, I feel, and I'm going back to the romantics, it's there in Coleridge. And I don't want to reduce what you're doing, John, to the scientific gaze, right?
Mhm.
But that the divine feminine, there's this whole tradition that the divine feminine will run from the scientific gaze because she can only be drawn out by something like a kiss in Sleeping Beauty, through the poetic, right? It's there in this work of fantasy genius, The Last Unicorn.
Mhm.
Um, and it's there in the cult of chivalry that to take the more left-brained approach to the divine feminine, she's always going to confuse or she's going to hide. But like, what do you say about that tradition?
Socrates. So the
Mhm.
daemonium is in Socrates as his muse, and yet it never calls him free from dialogical rationality. It calls him out of monological rationality, self-referential rationality, but it always calls him to dialogical rationality. And we also have to understand, I'm not recommending bringing the scientific gaze while you are in the practice. I'm
Mhm.
talking about bringing the scientific gaze when after or outside of the practice to try and understand
Mhm.
what's going on. Let me
Interesting.
give you an
Mhm.
analogy. I don't go in when somebody's in the flow state and start asking them questions because you know what I'll break? The flow state. But
Mhm.
Mhm.
do I think I can study the flow state? Yes, and I've published on it and done work on it, and that helps to understand better what's going on in the flow state and how we could do a couple things, maybe enhance it, but also couple it better to, like, if we don't do this, look what's happening. The flow state is being taken up and being commodified and
Right.
being manipulated by corporate forces, right? But if we have a deeper scientific understanding and we wed that to the cultivation of virtue and wisdom, then we
Mhm.
can do a great service.
Wow.
So that's how I would answer you.
Fascinating.
Yes.
Well,
Okay.
and I think also,
Yeah,
John,
really fascinating.
John, I think also what part of what's probably contributing to the meaning crisis is the imaginal is pretty much disappeared
Oh yeah.
from education, right?
Yes. Yes.
So
Mhm.
with that used to, there used to be much more emphasis on that. And I think what we also see is because you're kind of depriving young people or people in general of this experience of the transcendent in the mundane.
Yes.
When somebody asked Robert Frost why he wrote poetry, he said, "Well, I write poetry because when I do, I tell myself things I didn't know that I knew." You know?
Ah, that's wonderful.
Yeah,
I
and
didn't know that.
my experience, like, sometimes I wrote that. Whoa, where did that come from? I have no idea where they came from. But I think, with the people who are concerned about, uh-oh, Vervaeke's looking at pagan gods now. Um, I think, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think in fact, was it last summer. I was walking. We're surrounded by woods. I'm walking out of the woods to the house, and out of the corner of my eye, I swear I saw the god Pan.
Mm, mm.
And and I had been thinking a lot about. I wrote a bit about him in one of
Some
my.
people would say you'd been drinking a lot, not thinking
That's
a lot.
right. But I think, to me, when people would probably accuse me of being, "Hey, he's been conjuring again," that I think, just like as what happens in writing poetry or in dreaming, that these entities, or whatever you want to call them, these presences, clothe themselves in a visual vocabulary we can relate to.
Mhm.
Otherwise, what would be the point, right?
It's not, as you noted, it's no coincidence that this is Hermes for me. I totally get
Mhm.
that, right? And the interesting thing for me is part of what has happened in the dialogue is I'm sort of, it's not just the Hermes imagery. I've been led to, the analogs like Thoth, like Hanuman,
Hmm.
right? And for me, also, Michael, the archangel, and
Mhm.
and it's been sort of like uh, Hermes is actually the through line between all of these, rather
Hmm.
than any one of them.
They're all archetypally related for sure.
Yeah, and again, that's been a way of not sort of locking into any kind of, I
Hmm.
guess, idolatry or whatever you want to call it. For
Right.
me,
And
uh,
I, and I, and then they're spontaneous, and that's probably one of the more important things about that. Like
there's
dreams are spontaneous.
yeah, they're spontaneous, but unlike dreams, they're spontaneous, but they're spontaneous they arrive impregnated with intelligibility. That if you are, to my mind, if you're reverentially in right relationship with him, that intelligibility will unfold for you.
Mm.
And I was just lecturing on this today, but intelligibility, right? If it's connected to reality, and reality is an inexhaustible fount of intelligibility. If
Mhm.
it's connected to reality, the intelligibility, the light, the phenomena, the shining in of intelligibility is
Mhm.
inseparably bound up with like the withdrawal into the inexhaustible mystery, right?
Right.
And so you have to be properly, like, you have to have a proper reverential stance. But if you do, you'll get the, oh, here's the intelligibility unfolds, but it's simultaneously always calling you to the horizon of the intelligibility and what is beyond that. And remembering that.
Mhm.
I take Drew Hyland's argument very seriously, that he said what Plato is trying to get us to realize is that we are simultaneously finite and capable of transcendence. If we just embrace our finitude, we fall prey to despair and servitude. If
Right.
we just embrace our our transcendence, we fall prey to inflation and hubris. But if we hold them together in tonos, a creative tension, we will properly realize
Mhm.
our humanity. And for me, that's not just words. That is what I'm trying to enact when I come into the relationship with these kinds of
Yeah.
numinous aspects of reality, if I can put it as nebulously as that.
No, and what you just described is the Pythagorean monochord, right?
How do you
Because
mean?
in the monochord, I mean, that's Pythagoras's last words were study the monochord. And
Uh,
monochord is a one stringed instrument which they use to study intervals. And
yes.
the idea was that like if you're thinking of a guitar, where the strings go to the bridge would be the earth, and where they're tuned, well, God does the tuning, but at the nut at the top would be heaven, right?
Mhm.
And beyond it is God pulling the strings. But what keeps it in balance is the tension of the string,
Yes.
right?
And
And the
the
balance
same,
point is the middle of that
yeah.
string, which is the octave, right?
You have the same imagery in the Buddha, the Enlightenment, right? He gets out of the water, the little girl saved him, and he hears the musician teaching the apprentice. No, you have to understand, you can't tighten the string of the lyre too tight or too loose. You've got to find the
Hmm.
middle. And the middle path, like it is to live in this resonant tonos properly. And again, Hermes personifies that. And you see,
Absolutely.
this is what I mean about it. It just keeps sort of rolling on
Hmm.
itself in a powerful way.
No, you mentioned earlier, John, um, uh, work with DMT.
Yes.
And so I had an interesting experience a year ago, Thanksgiving, with two of my kids. After dinner, we're sitting around in the living room, and my then was had to be 21 or 20 or 21-year old was asking me if I'd ever heard of DMT. And I'd heard about it, but I hadn't read anything about it. And I said, well, I don't know. And he's explained what he'd been reading. And then my 30 was 31 at the time. My 31-year-old said, oh, yeah, I have a friend who's been doing that. I said, well, what happened? He said, well, at first he went on a trip and he saw the elves and
Yeah,
they were,
space elves. Yeah.
yeah, and he was like interested and it was all fascinating. And then he went back a week later and he saw the elves again. And one of the elves turned to him and said, hey, you're not supposed to be here. But he didn't pay attention. Then a week later, he went back again and it's the same scenario. And he sees the same elves, and the same elf turned to him again and yelled at him and said, I thought I told you not to come back here.
Yeah.
It's not for you. Okay, get out of here. Um, so my question is, what have you, because I was actually discussing this with some students the last week, saying how fascinating it is, but I don't know what it is. And what have you discovered it is happening in those experiences, and especially the fact that they go back to the same place, it seems.
Sort of. You have to be really careful because of the like it's when you one of the things that's come out of the longer study that I mentioned, where people can stay in it longer, it's not quite like that. There's a lot of that's happening because of the brevity of the experience and reconstructive memory, and the
Okay.
fact that we've got a thing in our left hemisphere that's wrapping narratives rapidly around things, and the way it's getting stored in memory. Um, so but nevertheless, and the fact that this happens to it happens to multiple people that they get this.
Hmm.
So I'm going to say something that's initially going to sound like an orthogonal digression. So let me do it, and then let me as a way of
I trust you.
getting to something. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so John Geiger in the Third Man Factor talks about this experience. There's two people doing ice climbing. I don't understand rock climbing, let alone ice climbing.
Yeah.
But my stepson and stepdaughter, they do rock climbing, and it's powerful. I get that. It induces the flow state, basically. But anyways, these two people are ice climbing, and I guess unexpectedly to me, but maybe to them, they fall. And one dies immediately. The other guy's in the snow, and he's hurt, and he's bleeding and everything, and he's thinking, I'm just gonna die. And then he gets the felt presence, the sensed presence walking up and saying, get up. Your nose is bleeding. It's snowy. You can use the blood on the snow so you don't walk in circles, and that's how you can get out. And that's how he got out. Now, what do you do with that? And here's where I'm coming around. Well, what you do is you do a lot of work that we already have from the 60s onward about implicit learning. We pick up huge, complex patterns, and you can show this experimentally. And of course, the only experience we have of that knowledge is intuition. In fact, I think Hogarth's right. Intuition is just what implicit learning has learned and what can come up. And what seems to happen is, and and this is maybe what's happening with dream figures, they plug into some implicit learning that has not been readily connected to standard egoic consciousness, and advice is given, and please note that implicit learning isn't just psychological. It's picking up on complex patterns that are disclosing reality in some way. So it's often, like I say, transjective rather than just merely subjective or objective. And
Wild.
I think that's a plausible thing to be investigating, because we do have a lot of experimental work about it. Like, so what you can do is you can use a Markov grammar, artificial grammar that just says, like, when I'm putting letters and numbers together, the rule is I always have to have two odd numbers if I put any number down. They're just arbitrary rules, right? And I make letter strings. And what you do is you show them to people. You show them a bunch of these. Here's one, here's one, and they're long enough that you can't possibly hold them in memory, explicit working memory. Here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one. And then what you do is you stop, and then you create two new sets of strings. One, new strings, but generated from that same grammar, and then other strings generated by a different grammar. And then you give them to people and you say, can you tell me which of these new strings belong with the ones you previously seen? And people can do this well above chance.
Hmm.
They can do this well above chance. And then if you ask them how they do it, they give you two answers typically. One is, I don't know, which is the honest answer. The other is the confabulator. Oh, well, I'm doing this and this and this. But if you actually were to implement their advice, it does not predict their success. So it's just a confabulatory narrative. And I'm not saying they're lying. They're probably sincere, but it's not actually what they're doing, right? Now, the thing about this is, and this is why, again, if we could bring knowledge to bear on it, there's power and peril to such implicit learning, because implicit learning doesn't clearly distinguish between, it picks up on complex patterns, but if you don't educate it at all, and that's why Hogarth's book is called Educating Intuition, it doesn't distinguish correlational patterns from causal patterns, right? And that's very problematic, because you can also be picking up on, right, what you think are real patterns and they're not. And then that can lead you into all kinds of significant difficulty. And so what you want to do is you want to try and figure out, how do I properly set up my environment so my implicit learning is actually picking up on causal patterns rather than correlational patterns? And so that's the kind of thing that I'm trying to give that as an example. As I gave you an answer, I plugged it into some cog sci, and then I get some interesting thing. A new question is, well, there's power and peril here. What can we do about educating this intuition so we can ameliorate the peril and afford the power? And so that would be how.
Heavy. That's heavy. Yeah.
Not an
It's
answer.
really intense. Yeah. It
If
makes
you
me
want,
think of AI in one sense, that everything becomes causal, and that in its own way that could contribute to a world where things that we discern as acausal, has been cast out or something. Does that make any
it
sense?
could. It
Yeah.
could. Yeah. I mean, yeah, and the capacity to pick up on complex. By the way, just I won't do the whole argument, but the argument that I published about how you educate intuition, building on Hogarth's work, is you basically do something analogous to what you do in science, because experimentation is about distinguishing causation from correlation. So what you want is, you want clear signal. You can't have vague ideas, right? You want tight feedback between, like, the independent and the dependent variable, right? And error matters. Your experiment can be falsified, right? Disconfirmed. Now, in what Hogarth says is, try and set up the situation where you're learning your implicit learning, because you can't replace implicit learning with explicit learning. If you give that original task to people and say, try and figure out the rules, they crap out, right? It doesn't
Right.
So what you have to do is you can explicitly set up the environment so it's structurally analogous to a scientific experiment. Now, those three criteria, clear feedback, tightly coupled and error matters, those are the three criteria that Csikszentmihalyi say induces the flow state. And the argument is that the flow state is an evolutionary marker for when we're doing really good implicit learning, because it's implicit learning that's picking up on real causal patterns.
Wow, wow, wow. I followed that. I got to think about that. That's wild.
Well,
But
and I
notice what that does. That
Yeah.
allows for a scientific connection between flow states over here and some of this, present stuff we've been talking about. And that means we can get something like a more comprehensive theoretical explanation that is not the dissecting gaze of science. I'm not doing that here. You see what I'm doing? I'm not explaining it away. I'm not dissecting it. I'm trying to afford, right, it's flourishing in our understanding in a way that can feed back into our practice in a flourishing manner.
Right. Well, it reminds me of Goethe's saying that something I can't remember, it's contemplatively examined opens up a new organ of perception within us.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Which is what you're describing, and it's what I wish there were more opportunities in not just higher education, but actually K-12 education to bring students to those kinds of experiences, because I think what we see is an ice with, especially after COVID. I mean, I've been dealing with students who are kind of suffering from PTSD still, and crying out for meaning, and which is what's wonderful. When I told this story before to Mike, but after COVID, I taught a course on romantic poetry, and it was just all women in the class. And for the longest time, students were not talking in class, even before COVID. They would never have a conversation for whatever reason. And it was kind of disconcerting. And all of a sudden, these girls, I said, so what do you think about John Keats? And they would just go into it. And then toward the end of the semester, I got to know them pretty well. I said, well, hello. I've been teaching for a long time, and for the last 10 years, no one is talking in class. But all of a sudden, you're talking. What? Why? And they said, we just went through COVID, and we figured out what's really meaningful. And this stuff is meaningful to us.
Well, that's John's work on connectivity too, right?
Yeah, very much.
Mm-hmm.
And and the flow state, if I need to take one measurement from you to tell me how meaningful meaning in life, like how much in that sense, not semantically meaningful, but how meaningful your life is, one good predictor is how often are you in the flow state, and to what degree is that flow state connected up to reality and not hijacked away in a video game or something else like that.
And you give people like our listeners a sense of a life well lived would have, like I've read something that said, like, when you're truly present might add up to like 3 minutes for an 80-year-old life. I've seen various things. Give people a sense, like, how much of our life do we live not in the flow state versus how much maybe we can, some people do, anything like that.
So, I mean, I hesitate to make a proclamation when I don't have the relevant scientific expertise. Where I do have expertise is you can flow more, and you can learn to flow in a way that transfers more broadly and deeply to multiple domains of your life and at multiple levels of your psyche. So it is very much something that is malleable, and malleable in sets of practices that can be pursued in a disciplined manner.
That's like the gospel in one sense. You just preached. You can do more. Do the work. Yeah, get a cultivation practice. Do something.
So last night we took my son, 23. He turned 23 yesterday for his birthday. We took he and his girlfriend out, and we had a picture of him when he was a baby, and I was trying to remember when he was. When I have 9 kids, so I can't remember when everybody was born, what time of day.
How many did you just say?
I have 9 kids.
Wow.
And
okay.
And I couldn't remember. And I was asking him, now, was he born? And he was born early in the morning, like 5 in the morning, right? And she said yes. And then I was talking about when my two youngest daughters are born. I think I caught them when they came out, because I was with a midwife, but I don't remember. And we were trying to explain to my son and his girlfriend and the others of our kids who were there, how talk about a flow state in the presence of a birth with a midwife. The energy there is indescribable. It's not like anything else.
I've got four of
And
those. It's
no
wild.
wonder I can't remember, because that was being right in a flow state, which it was a highly charged flow state, which I mean is pretty extraordinary. I mean, to see life come into the world, especially if it's your own child. But I'm sure it was the same for others who were there.
So, given that we've built a little bit here, and I've got to go soon, but
Mhm.
I want to make a proposal. So, let's talk about sort of imaginal augmentation. In the imaginal, you don't look at the image, you look through the image, and it augments or discloses some aspect of reality to you. And I think, while I get a lot from Corban, I think there's lots of ways in which people are doing that in more mundane dimensions of their life. And trying to understand that is important. But let's say we have something like imaginal augmentation, and then we have imaginal augmentation, right, of our transjective relationship to reality, so that we can not just know it propositionally, but we can actually experience it, and about how we're dynamically coupled in the way we've been talking about, and we can imaginally augment that, and get a deeper appreciation for it in both senses of the word appreciation. And then that, right, that is something that does transfer broadly and deeply into different domains and different aspects of the psyche. Is that possibly what these presences are?
Mhm.
Imaginal augmentation of these complex patterns of how we are dynamically coupled vertically and horizontally. And we have found particular ways in which flow states emerge that disclose aspects of the depths of psychological reality and external reality in some sort of resonant fashion. You mentioned earlier, like falling in love with somebody.
Mhm.
There's a reciprocal opening. They open up, and you open up, and it reciprocally opens. And so the idea that these presences are imaginal augmentations of sort of our transjective coupling in both, like I said, both vertically levels of the psyche and horizontally, between the subjective and the objective worlds, means that if that's right, then these presences belong to an even larger family of things like subtle body experiences and other things like that, that are other ways in which we might have an imaginal augmentation of our embodiment, where it's not understood as a property of our body alone, but as a property of our body in relation, coupled to reciprocally opening, reciprocally
Mhm.
unfolding with the environment, which is how it's understood in 4E cognitive science. Embodiment doesn't mean properties of the body just this way. It
Mhm.
means how the body is dynamically coupled to its environment. And and I actually presented this at a couple places where people are doing work on subtle bodies. And I made this argument. I said, you guys, you folks, sorry for that. You folks seem to be toggling between, you want to say the subtle body is a purely subjective experience and is
Mhm.
a purely objective, and there's all, and I said, it sounds to me like you're talking about something, and this was the argument I'm making, that's transjective, and
Right.
you've got some way of imaginally augmenting that transjective
Hmm.
aspect of embodiment and bringing it to conscious life and cognitive reflective life. And that sort of took off. And so
Mhm.
as
Great
now
news.
there are sort of three paradigms for understanding the subtle body. One is sort of it's some mysterious energy or force, sort of purely objective. One more subjective, it's a social constructed, and
Mhm.
now this new, which is being called the
Interesting.
imaginal
Yeah.
understanding.
Well, yeah,
Sophiology.
and that's actually, I was just talking with, I gave a lecture a
Zach,
couple weeks ago, and one of the things I was talking about was the subtle bodies and the way prior to the scientific revolution, where it's, we can call them natural philosophers, thought in more poetic terms. They had like the Buddhists, for instance, Buddhist physicians, even now, like a Tibetan Buddhist physician, will not diagnose a person as having congenital heart failure. He'll say there's a more poetic way, like the winds
Yep.
going through the valley are disturbing the silt in the sea or something like this, right? So they speak in more poetic terms, which is the same thing you see prior to the scientific revolution in well, even alchemy, right? They had a more metaphorical language for speaking about scientific truths as they knew them at the time.
Mhm.
So, which is interesting. But I don't want to take up much more of your time, John. I know you have things to do.
John, this
Um,
was really great.
Thank you so much, John
Mhm.
Vervaeke. I will we will tell people, we'll link your website in the description of the show.
Mhm.
And I'll tell you what, we got to do this again. This is it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and
Happy to
I
do it
could
again. Yeah,
I
it
could
was.
talk to you for a long time.
Yeah,
It's
really, really fascinating.
and thank you. It's nice to have an audience that is not sort of doing this sort of jarring response, but is sort of opening up and let's talk about it. Let's try and unpack it. Let's reflect on it. Let's see what's of value. Let's see what should be criticized. And so
Mhm.
I'm very appreciative of that. It was nice to be welcomed in that way. So thank you, both of you, for that.
Wow, that means a
Thank
lot.
you, John. All right, we'll see
And
you again, okay?
Take
all right,
good.
everybody, thanks for listening to the Regeneration Podcast. And there we go.